She rises before the household stirs. She mends a hem by the window, the needle moving in and out with a patience born of long practice. She is good with her hands. She has always been good with her hands. Outside, the streets of St. Gallen are still damp from the night. She folds her work. She puts on her shawl. She does not yet know what day this is, but she will remember it for the rest of her life. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let's begin. It is the year 1879, and the town of Bischofszell sits upon its ancient terrace above the confluence of the rivers Thur and Sitter in the canton of Thurgau, northeastern Switzerland. The old town is a place of considerable medieval character. Its Baroque town hall, its 14th century church of St. Pelagius, its stone bridge across the Thur, said to be among the oldest surviving of the late Middle Ages, all stand as quiet monuments to a history far older than the troubles that now concern us. By 1879, the town's population had grown to little more than 2,000 souls, many of them employed in small-scale industry and textile work. Coal smoke drifted thin and grey above the rooftops in winter. The bells of St. Pelagius marked every hour with a patience that the people of the town had long since ceased to notice. It was on the 24th of December, 1879, that a child was born into a modest household in this town, the fifth of 11 children. In a family held together less by warmth than by necessity, her name was Frieda Keller. She would live 62 years. She would suffer greatly, and she would be remembered not for the life she wished to live, but for a single act committed in a moment of absolute despair, an act that shook all of Switzerland and changed its law. Frieda Keller entered the world at Christmas, a detail that would seem, in different circumstances, almost a gift. Her father, Jakob Keller, was a shoemaker by trade, an honest and skilled craftsman who spent long hours at his bench repairing and fashioning footwear for the people of Bischofszell. Her mother, Anna, born Anna Kobe in Rapperswil, supplemented the family's income as a seamstress, mending garments for neighbours and, on weekends, serving at a local inn. The household was strict. It was ordered. It offered the appearance of respectability and very little of the tenderness that children require. Two of Frieda's siblings had not survived their early years, a grief that had settled over the family with the quiet permanence that such losses tend to leave behind. Frieda, it was said, had been affected by those deaths in ways she could not easily articulate. Sorrow had taken root in her early. The canton of Thurgau's textile and embroidery industries offered modest employment to those willing to learn, and Frieda proved a diligent pupil in all things. She attended the local school where her work was considered exemplary. She received, according to those who knew her, consistently strong marks. Outside of her formal schooling, she contributed to the household by working as a thread cutter in the embroidery trade, adding what she could to the family income. By the age of 16, she had secured a position as an apprentice ladies' tailor. Her employer, it is recorded, described her as a well-behaved and diligent girl who gave no cause for criticism. She was precise, patient, and capable. She was, in short, everything that a young woman of her station in late 19th century Switzerland was expected to be. When her apprenticeship concluded, Frieda returned home, intent on learning to cook and manage a household, skills she believed essential to her future as a wife and mother. She was 18 years old. She had reason to believe that a respectable life lay ahead of her. It was then that her father arranged for her to assist at the inn of a close family friend, a married innkeeper by the name of Karl Zimmerli, the proprietor of the restaurant known as Zur Post, situated in Bischofszell. Zimmerli was a man of standing in the community. He was trusted. He was well known. He was, in every visible respect, a pillar of the kind of order the town prided itself upon. He was also a predator. Frieda's sister Bertha, 3 years her elder, had worked for Karl Zimmerli before her. Bertha had refused to continue, offering no explanation, simply declining to return. The refusal of a woman who had no language permitted to her for what she had experienced. The record suggests she told no one at first. The record suggests she was not alone in her silence. Frieda knew none of this when she began her duties at the inn. She served guests. She assisted in the kitchen. She did as she was asked. She was, by all accounts, content enough in those early weeks. In August of 1898, Karl Zimmerli sent her to the cellar to fetch wine. She had barely descended when he followed. He locked the door behind them. In the close, dim silence beneath the inn, he assaulted her, threatening her with violence should she resist or speak. When it was over, he told her she was never to speak of it. He told her, specifically, that if she informed her father, there would be consequences. She was 18 years old. He was her father's trusted friend. She had no means of redress and no expectation of being believed. She withdrew. She made excuses not to return. For a week, she found reasons to stay away. Eventually, her father, unaware of what had transpired beneath his friend's roof, insisted that she go back. She went back. Some weeks later, Zimmerli asked Frieda, as she was a trained lady's tailor, to repair a dress belonging to his wife. She completed the work and brought it to his room. His wife was away from the premises. He assaulted her again. The pattern was now fixed. Each visit became a source of dread that she could share with no one. 6 weeks after the second assault, Frieda understood that she was with child. She left Bischofszell and made her way to the nearby city of St. Gallen, where she found employment as a seamstress and concealed her condition for as long as she could. She said nothing. She mended and stitched and kept her silence, carrying everything within herself through those long autumn months. She had learned, as so many women of her era were compelled to learn, that silence was the only shelter available to her. Silence and the needle moving in and out, in and out. The evening of the 7th of June 1904 was unsettled. An Italian couple, Liliana Pellizzari and Luigi Lavagni, were walking through the Hagenbuchwald forest in St. Fieden, a village on the outskirts of St. Gallen. It was shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening. A violent thunderstorm had moved through the region earlier that day, and the woodland floor was disturbed, leaves displaced, soil loosened, shallow arrangements of earth broken open by the force of water and wind. As Pellizzari and Lavagni passed through the trees, something arrested their attention. Partially visible among the disturbed undergrowth lay the body of a young child, clothed, partially concealed by foliage and earth, in an advanced state of decomposition. The neck, chest and legs were covered with mud and leaves. A piece of string was observed around the boy's neck. They called for the police immediately. Officers attended the scene and noted the evident signs that the remains had been interred. The shallow grave, it was believed, having been disturbed by the storm earlier in the day. The presence of the string about the neck led investigators to conclude, from the outset, that the child's death had not been the result of accident. A medical examination was ordered at once. The coroner determined that the child had been dead for an estimated 6 to 8 weeks, placing the death at approximately late April of that year. The child could not be immediately identified. The body was examined and the clothing catalogued. On the 13th of June, the public prosecutor's office placed a description of the boy and his garments in the local press, a notice appealing to any member of the public who might recognise the child. The response came from within the Tempelacke Children's Institution in St. Gallen. 2 sisters from the establishment, named in subsequent records as Sister Lena Rueg and Sister Malwina Durisch, came forward on the 14th of June to report that the boy's clothing matched that of a child who had been in their care, Ernst Keller, born the 27th of May, 1899. He had been 5 years old. His mother, Frieda Keller, was known to reside in the city. She was 24 years old, and she worked as a seamstress. Officers proceeded that same day to the home of her sister, Bertha Keller Iselin, where Frieda was staying. The post-mortem examination established the cause of Ernst Keller's death as strangulation. In the German forensic record of the period, the term employed was a Drosseln, signifying death brought about by constriction of the throat. The string recovered from about the child's neck was consistent with this finding. The time of death, determined by the degree of decomposition and corroborated by the testimony that would later emerge, was placed at approximately late April of 1904, aligning precisely with the period following Frieda's removal of the child from the Tempelacke institution on the 2nd of May. It was established that the identification of the remains had been confirmed through the clothing. The 2 sisters from the Tempelacke institution, upon examining the garments described in the press notice, made a positive identification on the 14th of June, 18 days after the body had first been discovered. The forensic record noted that the clothed state of the remains had assisted materially in this identification, as the decomposition of the body itself would otherwise have rendered recognition impossible. When officers arrived at her sister's home on the 14th of June and confronted Frieda Keller with the finding, she did not attempt to deny what had occurred. She confessed immediately and without hesitation. She stated that she had taken Ernst into the Hagenbuchwald forest. She stated that she had taken his life there. She stated that she had buried him. She described herself as a woman who had run out of every other option, and who had believed, with a certainty born of long suffering, that there was no future for either herself or her child. Her confession was recorded in detail. She was formally charged and placed in custody. She was 24 years of age. She had, by her own account, planned the act and carried it out. She had then written a letter to the Tempelacke institution in June, informing the nuns that little Ernst was settling comfortably into his new life with an aunt in Munich. That letter had been received and filed without suspicion. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. Frieda Keller was arrested at her sister Bertha Keller Iselin's home in St. Gallen on the 14th of June, 1904. During the midday hour, she was taken into custody without resistance. The charges laid against her were those of willful murder. She was remanded before the cantonal authorities and held to await the formal opening of trial proceedings. The matter was set before the Saint Gallen Cantonal Court. Her trial was scheduled to begin on the 11th of November of that same year. The trial of Frieda Keller opened on the 11th of November 1904 at the St. Gallen Cantonal Court. The proceedings attracted widespread public attention. Hundreds of citizens gathered, and the hearing was reported in newspapers throughout the Swiss Confederation. Frieda sat pale and composed in the dock throughout the 2 days of testimony. She gave the impression, to those who observed her, of a woman who had long since exhausted all feeling. The defence counsel placed before the court a careful account of the circumstances that had preceded the act. The defence emphasised the sequence of events beginning with the assaults committed by Karl Zimmerli, proceeding through Frieda's abandonment by her father, the death of her mother, the dissolution of her engagement, and the impossible position in which she had found herself when the Templacher institution had informed her that it could no longer provide a place for Ernst. The defence argued that this was not a calculated and cold-blooded killing, but an act of extreme emotional desperation, and submitted that the appropriate finding was that of manslaughter rather than murder. Sister Lena Rug and Sister Malwina Durisch of the Templacher institution gave testimony regarding Frieda's visits to her son. They described a woman who arrived infrequently, who struggled to maintain the care payments, and who, during her visits, remained distant, declining to embrace the child or participate in the institution's events, including Christmas celebrations. Though the child greeted his mother with evident joy, she did not, the sisters testified, return his affection in kind. Bertha Keller, Frieda's sister, gave testimony that corroborated the account of Karl Zimmerli's conduct, describing his habitual pursuit of young women in his employ and his use of threats to ensure their silence. Zimmerli himself faced no prosecution. He was not before the court. The prosecution maintained that the law admitted no exception, that a defenceless child had been deliberately killed, and that the evidence of premeditation, the false letter to the institution, the choice of the forest, the string, compelled a finding of murder. The law, as it then stood in the canton of St. Gallen, made no provision for the consideration of circumstance or motive. On the 12th of November 1904, the court pronounced its verdict. Frieda Keller was guilty of murder. She was sentenced to death. The sentence fell upon the public with the force of something dropped from a great height. Across St. Gallen and beyond, in cities and towns throughout the Swiss Confederation, the verdict became the subject of heated discourse. What had the law accomplished? A woman who had been violated, abandoned, impoverished, and driven to the very limit of human endurance, had been condemned to die. The man whose actions had set all of this in motion, Karl Zimmerli, innkeeper of Bischofszell, rapist of at least 2 young women in his employ, faced no legal consequence whatsoever. Feminist associations mobilized swiftly and with considerable determination. They called the verdict a total miscarriage of justice and framed it publicly as evidence of the manner in which the legal apparatus of Switzerland treated women, as instruments of male interest and objects of moral condemnation, but never as persons deserving of protection or understanding. Prominent voices joined the chorus of protest. The writer Karl Albert Loosely lent his considerable public standing to the campaign for clemency. The distinguished psychiatrist Auguste Forel, one of the most eminent scientific minds in Switzerland at the time, declared publicly that the true culprit in the matter was not Frieda Keller, but Karl Zimmerli, the man who had exploited her, and who bore no legal accountability for his obligations or his actions. Forel would later include his analysis of Frieda's psychological state in his major published work on human sexuality, situating her case within his broader arguments on social circumstance and criminal responsibility. The press did not speak with one voice. Several publications criticized the severity of the sentence and echoed the calls for clemency. The Catholic newspaper Die Ostschweiz, however, described Frieda Keller in its pages as a cold-blooded murderer who had led an indecent life with numerous lovers, a characterization that bore no relation to the documented facts of her existence, but reflected, with painful clarity, the manner in which a fallen woman might be spoken of without consequence. In 1904, the pressure mounted. On the 28th of November 1904, just 16 days after the death sentence had been pronounced, the Cantonal Council of St. Gallen voted by 156 votes to 1 to commute the sentence. The death penalty was set aside. In its place, life imprisonment in solitary confinement, with the additional condition that Frieda Keller was never to speak publicly of her trial. She was not to be executed. She was to be silenced. She served 15 years. The conditions of her solitary confinement were harsh by any standard. Her sisters, who understood more than most what Frieda had endured in that strict, cold household in Bischofszell, and what she had survived in the years that followed, never ceased to fight for her. They petitioned. They wrote letters. They kept her name from being buried entirely beneath the weight of institutional silence. An initial petition at the close of 1914 was refused. They persisted. On the 25th of November 1919, Frieda Keller was released from prison. She was 40 years old. The woman who walked out had been profoundly altered by what she had endured. She suffered from depression. She experienced bouts of delirium. Those who knew her remarked that she was a diminished version of the person she had been. A consequence, it was observed, of years spent in isolation that would have broken a great many souls entirely. She found work as a seamstress again. Her hands still remembered what her mind was struggling to hold. In 1931, she took employment as a cleaner at a hotel. In 1937, she suffered a stroke, and her health declined steadily thereafter. Her mental condition deteriorated. She was provided with care and support at the cantonal hospital in the town of Münsterlingen, in her native Thurgau, not far from the town where she had been born 62 years before. On the 7th of September 1942, Frieda Keller died there. Her case did not die with her. It had already entered the deliberations of the legal scholars and reformers who were working through the early decades of the 20th century to construct a unified Swiss criminal code. When that code came into force, also on the 1st of January 1942, the very year of her death, it contained a distinction that had not existed in the law that condemned her. A formal differentiation between homicide and murder, with murder defined as requiring a particular absence of scruple, an odious motive. The law had learned, however belatedly, to ask not merely what had been done, but why. Karl Zimmerli's name does not appear in any record of prosecution or conviction. In the old monastery quarter of St. Gallen, where the stone is dark with centuries of rain, and the footsteps of the condemned once echoed through the prison corridor beside the Klosterhof, the buildings have changed very little since that November in 1900, and a young woman in a bare cell waited to learn whether she would live or die. The city still knows her name. It has not forgotten what it witnessed. Some stories do not end. They simply fall quiet and wait.